So we want to welcome everybody that's joining us live and also in our on-demand recording of this panel discussion. Today, the topic that we'll be covering is how technology can help and hurt succession planning. And we'll be revolving that discussion around how to kind of codify institutional knowledge as people retire from their roles and move on to different roles within the organization, and how to maintain and improve business processes through that. So we'll start with a quick introduction here for each of our panelists. We want to thank each of you for joining here today. We certainly appreciate you taking the time and for sharing your experience with our audience here today. So first we have is Stefan Mersing from Shell. He's joining, he's actually been in the energy industry for over 15 years. He's predominantly worked in a technical capacity, supporting both projects and existing assets across different countries and in multilingual environments, onshore, offshore, remote, centrally, and in joint ventures. As he progressed throughout his career, he transitioned to become a project discipline engineer on a major greenfield project in a joint venture, responsible for developing solutions to the complex multidisciplinary issues by working directly with the FEED and EPC contractors to implement solutions. He now applies these skills as a senior systems engineer and continues to support Shell projects globally to improve their capital, engineering, and carbon efficiency across the entire project lifecycle by applying systems engineering and requirements management principles. Let's welcome Stefan as one of our panelists today.
Hi, everybody. Happy to be here.
Next up, we have Benga Oludotin. Benga is a chartered civil engineer, currently an associate with WSP UK. He has over 13 years experience in the design, assessment, and maintenance of highway and rail structures. He is a lead for modern methods of construction for the transport and infrastructure business of WSP UK. In addition, Benga is a supervising civil engineer with the Institution of Civil Engineers, a member of the ICE Initial Provincial Development Panel, and was a former chair of the ICE West Midlands Regional Committee. He is involved in promoting the industry to the next generation of engineers through his role as a STEM ambassador. Thank you, Benga, for taking the time to be one of our panel members today.
Thank you, James. Looking forward to it.
And next is Mark Davies. Mark is the director behind HAAR Technologies and Engineering based in the UK. He has over 35 years of hands-on engineering experience, specializing in mechanical engineering design, product development, and engineering design management across a variety of industrial sectors. He is currently working with multiple initiatives with IOGP, that's the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. Specifically, he's deeply involved in an oil and gas industry-wide digitization joint industry project. You may have seen Mark at several conferences globally speaking about requirement engineering, and today we welcome him as a panelist.
Hi, everybody, and glad to be here as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And our fourth panelist today is Jordan Kyriakidis. He has 20 years of experience leading diverse teams of driven and high-performance individuals, first as a scientist with numerous international publications, and now as co-founder and CEO of QRA Corp. QRA's disruptive technologies are changing how companies and governments identify and mitigate risk in complex projects from the RFP stage onwards, especially projects involving and introducing new technologies in regulated industries. He has lived and worked in Europe, the UK, the US, and Canada. He holds a PhD summa cum laude in quantum theory from the University of Basel in Switzerland. So thank you, Jordan, for taking the time today.
Thank you, James. Pleasure to be here, and welcome to all the panelists as well.
Yes, and I am also with QRA Corp, who is hosting the discussion today, and I'll be moderating the discussion as we go along here. So as we mentioned off the top, this is going to be a panel discussion, so we'll be exchanging thoughts and ideas throughout. We're also going to have a few polls from the audience throughout and have an opportunity for audience questions. So any questions that you have as you go along, enter those into the chat, and we'll field those from the panel here as we go. So jumping in here to the actual topic of our discussion today, as you mentioned off the top, the goal is to talk about how technology can help and hurt succession planning. And so I guess first it would be helpful to find out what the challenges are around succession planning and why we're looking for solutions along those lines. So the first topic for discussion, and I think probably we'll direct this to Benga for the first question here, is around the challenges that arise when organizations have key members of their workforce and high volumes of their workforce entering into retirement, which is something that we're going through right now. So Benga, maybe if you just wanted to start us off with your thoughts on some of the challenges that can be present in those stages for different companies.
Thank you, James. And I was going to say that succession planning really is a topic that I've really been sort of working on and looking at, because internally, or rather from my start of my career, I was working with quite a few senior engineers who had like over 30, 40 years experience. And the question was, how could I glean all that experience that they've had from them within such a short span of time? So I've always understood the challenges, from the start of my career over 13 years ago. But in terms of the challenges that we face with retirement, we need to look at it from the sort of human perspective, because it's all about the relationships that have been built. And that's one critical factor that you can't really quantify, because these experts have built and developed relationships within the organizations and externally as well. And quite a number of occasions, you can't really quite tell externally how much that's been, the quantifiable aspect of that. Internally, you might be able to capture it because you know who they've been speaking to in terms of emails or reports and all those sort of things. But the other aspect then is around the client's perspective, that when they leave the business, does the reputation of the organization go down in their estimation, or does it remain at the same level? And I think it's all about understanding how to maintain that business continuity is the critical element that we need to really consider and focus on for succession planning. And that's really the business driver behind it. Because if, as a business and organization, that your key members of staff leave and then your business goes south, that's not the right approach to take. And I think the board shareholders will definitely agree that's not the right approach to take. So there is an imperative to have a succession plan in place to ensure we have business continuity. So those are my sort of key points that I'll just pick up from there.
Yeah, and for anyone else here, anyone that wants to speak to this on the topic as well, maybe just a quick introduction to what that even looks like. So we talk about, doing succession planning, what is involved at the high level of accounting for some of those risks and variables when somebody steps out. Your thoughts on that? Go ahead, Stefan.
So I think for me, succession planning has a couple of elements to it. So one thing is you have a very dynamic and changing landscape, especially in the business that we're in at the moment. So if we look at what Shell was doing when I joined, and what Shell is doing now, the landscape is very different. Going back to something that Benga said, I fully agree. It's maintaining business continuity, but business continuity doesn't necessarily mean doing the same things. It means continuing your business going forward. So you need to have a succession plan in place to ensure that not only you maintain business continuity, but the critical knowledge that you've built up over the long term, over the time that you've been in business, that is then transferred, not necessarily transferred to everyone, but it's transferred to the right people who can make those decisions going forward. So for us, we see business continuity planning as a very key step, but also from my point of view, it's just about looking at, when I come in at a more at the entry level positions in the company, I look to see what are the senior positions that I would be then potentially competitive for, and how do you build up that knowledge? Who are the people you have to speak to? What's the experiences you have to gain? What are the projects, or what's the work that you have to do to make yourself competitive, such that when those people move on or they change, you can then step into that role and make sure you're successful. So I think from that perspective, I see continuity as one of the fundamental fundamental pillars of any successful business. But I think we're going to talk a lot about the technology as well, and how that can be a hindrance and also a support. But in terms of specifically on the support level, we have all this information now that we can store in a large number of different tools, a large number of different places. We don't have, for example, that big book of knowledge or the big black book that everyone carries around with them anymore. That's now been transferred to some sort of a cloud system or some sort of online tool, and that can now be searchable, that can be filterable, that can be actually partitioned into a way the right people get the right information. So I do see a big help there from technology.
So it's interesting points you bring up there, Stefan, and it kind of blends well with what Benga is saying. What I'm hearing is that there's two aspects of it, two maybe course aspects to it. So one is when a senior, and let's say a senior engineer, when they retire, they take with them all that technical and engineering knowledge that they've gained through experience. Right now, experience and aptitude aren't the same thing, but largely they kind of correlate, right? And so when they leave now, it's all that technical knowledge of how to do the engineering that needs to be done. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it that you touched on, and so did Benga, and I think he called it the human aspect, is that, when you're in a large organization, there is, technical knowledge is necessary, but not sufficient. You have to also be able to execute and get things done. And that's knowing like who to talk to, what parties to bring together, how the organization functions, to be able to weave your way through it to get to the place that you need to do. That, if anything, seems to me to require experience. Is something that you definitely need to do. It's not possible to gain it without experience. So I'm wondering if do you guys see it that way with these two sort of cases, and is one more important than the other, or do you see it both as being equally important?
I would say that equally important, and I just wanted to bring up that it's not just retirement. From the projects I'm working on recently, we're seeing a lot of people wanting to transition into the energy transition side of the business, the more greener, more environmentally parts of the oil and gas sector. So that's a massive pull as much as is retirement. So our projects within Jib33 is a collaboration of 12 organizations from Australia through to the Middle East, through to Europe, through to North and South America. So we have a real spectrum of people, so 12 people in each work group. And we have a very, very good mix of ages. We have, as a person that's probably here nearing the retirement age out of this call, I'm qualified to say that we have people in their late 20s, I would say, through to 60s, and that's quite consistent on our projects as well.
Mm.
In that way, I guess people staying with companies for a shorter period of time or staying within teams and divisions for a shorter period of time means that you don't sort of have this long path of preparation of being like, we know within the next 10 years this group of people are going to be retiring. It's something that needs to be ongoing, that at any given time you need to be prepared for different people to kind of drop in and out of those positions. So I would say that leads nicely into the next part of our discussion, which is actually around the legacy mentality. So in order for people to be able to take the things that they're doing and execute them and improve on those processes, they actually need to be able to document it and make that information accessible to other people that they can step into it. But that requires actually doing it differently than the way that that person with all of the expertise has been able to do it in the past. So I think, Mark, your role in trying to codify this across multiple businesses across an entire industry would you'd certainly run into that in your process as well, of trying to codify something that anybody from any organization can read and understand what they're doing.
Absolutely.
Maybe,
so
think about that.
So we're a typical work group. Like I said, we have 12 engineers working on it, and we would normally use an established international standard from IEC, NFPA, API, etc. And what we tend to do is do a supplementary specification for that, for the procurement of that said item. So we bring in subject matter experts with many years, 10, 20, 30 years in some instances, experience on the subject. And what we're trying to do is get them to change the way they do things. They've always procured it in a certain way. A lot of it is historically driven because they had a problem in 1987. They've sort of carried it through the specifications. As in my previous industry, in the firefighting industry, we used to see that a lot. You would find an engineer would have a good specification, change to another project, and probably copy and paste that into their next specification, then do again the same again onto another project. So you're constantly carrying it through. It's almost ingrained in their mindset that, oh, this is a good specification. We use this on this project. We'll reuse it, and you're just multiplying the problem. And change is a challenge. And we often ask within our groups, why do some work groups work better? Is it discipline? Is it the electrical versus the mechanical? Is it the offshore people versus the subsea people? Maybe, maybe not. Is it down to the age? Is it the younger engineers are more receptive to change? And I'm not necessarily convinced that is the answer to. And also, is it geographically based? North America versus Europe versus Asia? Is it a different mindset? So there are lots of factors. We still don't have the answers to that. I wish we did, because then that would allow us to move more smoothly in our operations in different projects.
And
yeah, I think
it's
if I can just jump in briefly, James, I think exactly the Jib33 initiative that Mark was talking about there, that is one really good way of sort of codifying all of the combined knowledge of all the different operators, all the different contractors, all the different suppliers, and putting it into one central repository in the form of a specification that then can be reused. And we do get some of the learnings, we do get some of those reuse of, oh, that was a good specification that I used in a previous life on a previous project. That type of standardization drive is making big impacts, not just in terms of the way we look at sort of cost or schedule, but also in terms of efficiency. As an engineer, you don't want to be combing through thousands of specifications or thousands of documents filled with lots of long and difficult to understand requirements when you've already got something there that has been reused, and it provides a product that can be immediately put into operation in one of your existing assets and one of your existing projects, and that it will work, and it's importantly it's been already essentially assured or looked at by those more senior and more experienced engineers, and they've already provided their sort of sign off. I don't want to say sign off, but they've already provided their sort of assurance on that.
Yeah, I was going to say, with the civil engineering industry, it's quite similar, because highway schemes, railway schemes, we have good specifications, good standards that people take across different projects. But one sort of risk that we've noticed, Mark alluded to this, is they just seem to copy and paste and forget about context sometimes. And I think the context of the various projects and programs they work on is something that sometimes definitely needs to be addressed from at least I think the higher level, someone who oversees the whole program. Otherwise, the subject matter expert just takes that knowledge across without understanding the context in which it's been applied. So that's one risk that we've observed, and it's something that we've always sought to address by ensuring that there is one person that looks across the entire project to ensure it's fit for the use that it's been applied to.
Mm-hmm.
You were going to say, Jordan?
Yeah, actually, a similar point to what Benga mentioned is that it makes a lot of sense to have. You don't want to start everything from a blank sheet of paper and start everything from scratch. You want to have as much reusability as much as possible, and you want to keep the things that work and drop the things that don't work. And then if you do that well, you can converge to a standard, right? And that is really, that's one of the great things of the work that Jib33 is doing, is that seems to be the way it's going now, right? You kind of converge to a standard, especially if it's something that's cross industry. There is a danger also, and I'd be curious to see if you guys see this, is that as you start reusing these, you may have a senior engineer who's very authoritative, been there for a while, knows what they're talking about, and says, we're going to do it this way because I've done it this way in the past and I know this way works. And so this is the way to do it. And they bring across not only their best practices, but all the baggage that comes along with that as well. And that can kind of bring almost how much of it is best practices and how much is it accumulated dogma that goes from project to project. The young people don't have that, but they also don't have the experience to keep the good parts of it, right? So, do you guys see that in your work, that you need to find a way to distinguish between these two elements?
I think that's very, very difficult, especially if you're in a more junior role, to challenge someone who's more senior. I mean, there I really see two key areas that can help. One is the company culture, where you I've worked in company cultures where it's very top down, and this is the way it's going to be, and the senior people are always right, and you as a junior person, you can't really challenge that. And I've also worked in organizations where it's a very much a collaborative effort, where everyone sits around the table and says, this is how we've done it. I know this works, but let's hear other opinions. So I think it's fostering that culture to make sure people feel respected and valued and are actually able to make that contribution. And then secondly, there are cases where you can record, for example, lessons learned or things that have happened in the past, and then you say, well, this is how we did it in the past when we came across this and it worked. So then let's link that and use it going forward. So that's sort of definitely I see that in our industry. I mean, I think one of the first experiences I had when joining as a junior engineer, I went offshore to a platform and I met someone who said, I've been doing this since before you were born. So, you get these type of comments quite often, and it's being able to, be involved in a team or organization that makes you feel valued.
Mm-hmm. That's where I think the use of technology, especially we're seeing on Jib33. So we write a requirement. We then review it amongst the peers within the core team, the work group. It goes out for review. We have constant reviews, and this is done in the software. We currently use JAMA software. There's obviously Polarian and all the others. And you've got a digital history for that item. So you may go out for one single requirement. You may get 5, 6, 7, 8 comments on it in the first review. So that helps shapes that requirement. The key thing to it is every requirement needs a justification. So no matter how good a requirement is, we have to justify it into the project. What is the reason? And if somebody said, we always do it that way, that's the first sign to get it kicked out. So you have to give a substantive stand on why that requirement's in there. Not only do you need to justify it, you need to verify it. How do you actually prove that that's being done? So for example, if the pump needs shall have a drain hole 12 millimeters, how do you check that it's 12 millimeters? You probably link it to a general arrangement drawing or a quality intervention. So we build on that. So as it goes through the process, we go out for public review. So we deal with EPCs, we deal with suppliers. The general public can comment as well, plus all the operators, all the members. So at the end of that, from drafting to publication, we could have tens of, even 100 comments against that one requirement, and you do that for every requirement. So our specifications follow the parent standards, so they're typically revised every 5 years. So fast forward, we're now maintaining specifications that were done 5 or 6 years ago. We've got the history behind us. We can see why the decisions were made. We can see. So even though that engineer's left and we've got a new engineer, we've got the history back to that first one. So you fast forward another 5 years when we're at the next revision, you're going to have 10 years of data. You're going to have 12, 24 different engineers' opinions building up to why this requirement is needed. So it's an excellent use of the technology.
So that's actually that's really interesting, and I think the utility of it is pretty self-evident if you have a whole record of it. So that's good. And technology can help to record it and process it and have a record. It seems to me that depends a lot on the discipline in the team to actually record everything and record it accurately. Most of it, I guess, is in the written word. And so are there issues with that? I can imagine, like for smaller teams, for example, they don't have either the time or the maybe the motivation to actually record everything. So do you find that it requires a lot of discipline and effort to get people to actually write things down? I mean, we're a much smaller company, and I notice that a lot as well within my organization of, if we have a great record, you bring up the sets and here's how you want to do it. You lay out this process, but then people actually have to do that, right? And if it becomes just a checkbox, they'll just type anything in that text box, and it's very difficult to actually look at it and validate it. Is this a useful thing to write down? Are they doing are they following the spirit of the of the process.
On the whole, yes. I think we often give instructions. So when we go out to suppliers who don't, so the core team within the project use the software frequently.
Mhm.
So we've got a lead subject matter expert that does the hard graft, puts all the effort in. We've got a core team that then comments, and we try to educate on what is a good way of commenting. Just saying I don't like it or this will cost too much is not acceptable. We look for a solution rather than just a problem.
Mhm.
So yes, we do have to police it. We do have to push, but the alternative is most people would put it into. We love spreadsheets. Us engineers, we love spreadsheets, and that was the way the earlier phases were done. They were done in spreadsheets. They become unmanageable. They become too large. Whereas using the actual software itself, it is very easy to click through one screen to another screen and get the full history of that item on one page. That's the difference. The downside to it is you see a requirement typically in isolation, where we like to see a requirement as it would sit in the context of the requirement above and the requirement below.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say that in terms of records, definitely that is absolutely necessary. And within all the organizations I've worked for and with, it's been quite clearly stated you need to record everything. But the challenge always comes about how and why. Like Mark said, spreadsheets, everyone loves spreadsheets, but it becomes a point at where the spreadsheets become unwieldy and people disengage and stop engaging with it. And that's always the challenge, because you don't want to produce or create a process system that becomes so unmanageable that the benefits you're trying to, that you set the system up for, is no longer being achieved. And I think it's all about understanding how you create a process at the start that ensures that all the objectives that you're trying to measure against are not lost in all the vast information people record. And something Mark said was something that I've also picked up in terms of how people record. We've got 10 different people, and the joke is really, 10 different engineers, you get 20 different ways of, writing what is stated. But having a sort of structure and perhaps early training to say, right, this is how you need to comment, think through your process, but then this is how you need to put it down so that it can be easily understood and reflected upon and applied as we need it. So I think that's one point that I've sort of observed.
And you have a unique perspective as well, Beng, of being able to be involved in kind of traditional like highways projects, and then also like high-speed rail projects on the other end of the spectrum, where systems engineering is much more prevalent there. So how have you seen that difference in sort of the way projects are managed on sort of the systems engineering more method in the high-speed rail versus the more traditional means that are used for traditional highway projects?
They seem to be quite miles apart, which is quite fascinating. So with the rail projects, as you mentioned, there's a systems integration process in play, where at the very start, the requirements are all set out, and it's very clearly stated what the requirements are for the service, for the system that's been delivered. And it could run up to 7,000, 8,000, but they're all put within a database that is easily accessible, easily checked, can be verified throughout the design process. With the highways, it's a bit different, whereby the specification standards that are used are based on a standard, and people have developed their own sort of interpretations of those standards, which then carry through across different projects. So it's more challenging on the highways to ensure you have that consistent feel than it is on the rail, which has the sort of systems approach embedded into how they deliver their schemes.
And I think, Stefan, you could probably speak to this as being a key member of an industry that's trying to make that transition right now, of going from more of a traditional approach to managing projects and meeting the standards and specifications, as sort of thrown in as a lone wolf systems engineer, as it seems at times. What's that transition like, of managing the transition into more of a systems engineering mindset, and to our original topic of sort of legacy way of doing things? How are you managing that in terms of going from those two different worlds that Beng has been talking about and trying to make that transition?
Yeah, so I would say the biggest challenge that I face in this role is not technology related at all. It's the human element that Benga mentioned already on, how do we make that change palatable, or even acceptable to the wider audience, the wider group of people that are going to be doing it. Because at the end of the day, you know, people are very comfortable in the way they've delivered in the past, the way they've done projects, the way they've managed assets. So to go from that to a very integrated systems engineering approach where you look at requirements specification, requirements definition, you know, I mean, if I look back even at my own journey along the requirements management process, the requirements definition, you know, you think just because you've done an engineering career, you've done an engineering degree, you've worked as an engineer, you can write good requirements, but that's actually not the case. You need training. You need to understand how the requirements are developed, how's the architecture behind them, where they're linked. You know, what are the key elements, and it's really about explaining that to people in such a way that you don't go and say what you've been doing for the last 30 years is all wrong. You need to do it this way now. This is the right way. It's more about taking an approach where you can say, you know, we are moving in a different direction. We're more integrated. Digital tools are coming at a faster pace that we can actually even handle them, and also the landscape change. If we look at the complexity of the projects that we're doing now, and just the pure data element that's coming into those, you know, it's not the same as what it was before. We are bringing in a lot more data because we have that integration with the sort of virtual data streams that we then want to process, and we want to put in a database. We want them to actually give us usable, tangible information later. So a very simple example, you know, when I started my career, we had a few transmitters on equipment, and if you wanted to know what those transmitters were telling you, what the health of the machine was, you had to phone the control room. There was a basic link that was potentially working to the office on shore, but generally you had to phone and find out, if you wanted the real information, what the operator was seeing in the control room. Now, today, fast forward to what I look at now, I can bring all that up on my screen right now, and just the volume of data that I can look at from not just those few transmitters, but the multitude of transmitters that we have installed, and also the cost of those transmitters has come down significantly, so we can put them everywhere. That used to be more the barrier. So it's how do you integrate all of that virtual with the physical, and that's why I think we need, well, that's why I see the journey to system engineering as being key in continuing for us to be a successful deliverer of projects and assets.
So you're basically saying from here, Stefan, is that it's not just it's a qualitative change. It's not just the fact that we need to get more efficient because of more business pressures pushing down. It's that the systems we're developing now are so complex that the way we used to do it is just not possible anymore. It's not even so much an efficiency. It's whether or not it's even possible to build these things in the old ways versus, you know, a more modern method.
I think it's still possible to do it in the traditional way, but you will miss a lot of the key elements that we now bring in. So, you know, when we look at, for example, our just very simply the how we manage the safety levels on equipment when they're operating, you know, that used to be something that you would set in the control room, and then that was it set. And if you wanted to change it, you had to go back to the control room or the control panel to do it. Now you can do that, you know, I can do that from here as the responsible engineer. But the problem is with that is there has to be a level of security behind that, because if I can do it from sitting here in the office, someone else can very easily piggyback onto my system and potentially do it, and then potentially change them to a more unsafe operating point. So there is all of that extra digital, for lack of a better word right now, that you have to consider and bring in, because you want to have that ability to do it remotely now. That's an expectation, and that's not something that the traditional ways in which we did things, because they just didn't have the experience that wasn't available when they were doing projects back then.
So that would also, you know, back to our topic now, or relating this to our topic of the technological impact here and how technology helps and hurts, it can actually be the digital processes that need to be followed sort of remove some of those gates that were previously present. You know, if somebody needs to go into the room and physically change something, you can have very easy controls of, you know, who has access to that physical space to get into. And so now that obviously requires more processes and more of a documented process that's going to be followed in order to, achieve the same result with all these digital technologies available. So in any of your experience, we have the kind of subject matter experts that know the way that these technologies can be implemented and how they can help, sort of having that high view of where this integrates into the rest of the process. But where do you see the biggest opportunity for improvements in the way those things are documented and how people access that documentation to know when you're doing a particular task? Where does the digitalization part of that fit in your experiences so far in helping people to actually, develop means to communicate those practices to everybody else?
Have to be, I'd say, databases, because it's all about the collation of all that information into an area that is easily accessible. And it's not, because you don't want the process to be so cumbersome that it's difficult just to get through the data to get what you need. It needs to be simple enough to access what you're looking for, but at the same time, like Stefan said, it's not just unsafe that anyone can, or unsecure that anyone can just go in and pick up what you need. But I think it's all about the access. For example, with cloud-based services that we've sort of moved on to, it's made it more easy for us to access information that others have, because previously we had this challenge of people saving stuff on their own computers, laptops, and we always keep asking, move it onto the server. But now everything's in the cloud. It's easy for us to quickly search through and access the right information, know who has the information, to then maybe have a word with them, have a chat with them. But I think it's just that sort of cloud-based knowledge repository that we've sort of found is similarly working now, and people seem to easily adapt to it because the interface is quite easy to use. It's not complex.
It's similar to what Mark had kind of mentioned earlier around the digitalization of this information. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Stefan.
James, sorry, I just wanted to, that's an excellent point you made there, Benga, about what people used to store information on their own hard drives or laptops or on paper. So it gave them a sense of authority, it gave them a sense of power, and it kind of secured their importance in the organization. Whereas now, one area I think technology can be a hindrance is in succession planning, things like that, is that those people now are very exposed because they're expected to put all that information, or it's all available in the cloud now, so they don't have that security anymore, so they don't feel as though they are that respected expert, that subject matter expert, because essentially they think, oh, if I can read it, anyone can go read it. But actually, it's not just about reading it. It's about being able to interpret what the information is telling you. So I think there is definitely an element of technology making people feel less secure about their own value or importance in an organization.
To the flip side of that, I think there's a great opportunity for younger people to show their strengths and to bring more to the table. If you've got two SMEs, one with 40 years experience and one with 15, it's more likely that the one with 15 years experience is going to be more adept at the technology side, on the computer side, on the database side. We had a subject where we were talking about cybersecurity of electrical systems, and the whole work group shift was from the more senior guys down to the more junior guys, and they just ran with it. And so they came up a level, and they were seen more as equals to the other guys based on this newer technology within the established technology.
And I think one way to, that relates back to a common thread that runs through all of us here is people working on requirements in that process. Is in the older method, you would have a particular standard that applied to a project. And so all of the information, like Mark was saying earlier, is in context of that document. You're doing this specific task on this particular type of project at this specific time. These are the steps, these are the processes that you need to follow in order to do that. Whereas in the digital world, you might have only small pieces of that apply to a future project. And so splitting all of that information up into those atomic pieces that can be used independently of each other. So you don't have to take a whole document and say, does all of this apply or does none of it apply? You can take those individual pieces, but that actually changes the way that people need to write. And Stefan, you had kind of mentioned this earlier. subject matter experts and people have a set way that they tend to document things or the way that they like to write things. So that's part of that shift of helping them see the benefit of having that information easily accessible in different formats. But how do you make that transition to show the benefits so that people are willing to change to more of an atomic approach to kind of documenting these things?
We're developing, or have started to develop, a library of common requirements. So for our equipment, most of it would have a nameplate on it. Most of it would be painted. Most of it would have lifting lugs on it. So we are building up databases, because we would have, I forgot the numbers, but overall the projects, each engineer would write slightly differently the same requirement. And in the past, we looked probably much in isolation on an individual project. Now we have the capacity to look across all projects using the software. We can search through every time we see the word lifting lug used, so we can check about the dimensions, about the strengths, about the testing, and we can use now the software to pull in more of our library details rather than having to write from fresh each time. So then that helps to speed the process up, because if we can pull it from the library, we can tell the whole 12 engineers that's pretty much non-negotiable. That's a library item. It's been developed, it's been verified, it's justified, we've got the coverage, let's skip on. So if we can get 10% of those into our specification, we effectively reduce the life cycle, the project time by 10%.
So are you saying, Mark, that in order to do that well, that you need to change, or you have changed or are changing, the way you actually write the requirements to make them a bit more amenable to this searchability? So is requirements being atomic, for example, much more important now than it was before, because it is much more electronically searchable and you can index on it as well?
As we evolve, so on the Jib33 project, if you go back to 2-3 years ago when I first started, our problem then was we would often have multiple imperatives in a requirement. Yeah, we know that's wrong. We've virtually, through using QB Scribe, we've virtually eliminated, well, I wouldn't say we're 100%, but we're high 90% eliminated it, and we certainly pick it up as we go through the production process. So we've eliminated that. We're now moving on, and I'm working with you guys on how we go to the next stage to make the requirements even better. And I think going down the line, we will start to look at the structure. We've not really looked at the syntax of a requirement in the past, because we're pretty much typically governed by the parent standard that we overlay, that we're supplement to. So I think we all know that these standards are not written the best. They've probably evolved over 50 years, but they've not evolved at the way that we evolved and have embraced digitalization. I think they are coming on board, and they're working with you guys as well to help improve that. But I think we're heading in that direction, and we get better with each year of writing specifications. We're learning. There is lessons to be learned each time, and we review back.
Would you say there's
I
a
think
process? Yeah, go ahead, Stefan.
Sorry, I was going to say I think the use of a tool to help people understand requirements quality and see the benefit. So we by writing clearer requirements, we can reduce the amount of effort an engineer spends on actually clarifying what they want. So we have a use case where where we buy a piece of equipment from a supplier that we've bought for many different projects, and we would send them a specification of requirements, and we get a number of comments and clarifications coming back from that supplier, and then we would go through this iterative round where we would actually come up with eventually a product. Now, when we looked at the quality of the requirements we're sending, and we actually improved them, in this case it was through using QB Scribe, we actually sent that same specification to that supplier. Now, it wasn't, when I say we, I mean the wider we in Shell. We actually came back and had very, very few clarifications, and that actually sped up the whole process, as Mark mentioned. You improve your engineering time, and I think that's the crux. If you can show the benefit to the person who's responsible for the requirement, writing the requirement, that when they focus on the quality and they get it right, it has a improvement in the amount of time that they have to spend actually clarifying it, I think you'll get a lot of traction. At least that's the way that we are pushing it in Shell, and that's where we're seeing a lot of people take it up because they see that benefit themselves.
It's actually probably a good time for one of our audience questions that's come in. We've had along this topic was, the person asked, what has been your biggest challenge to adoption when using technology to support capturing SME knowledge? So all of you had mentioned that that's something that you're focusing on, is taking the knowledge of the SMEs and getting them to communicate it in a way that's clear to everyone. What's been the biggest challenge in that process? And anyone can speak to that, of getting adoption from people in writing a certain way.
I can actually start from a toolmaker perspective, right? I think there'd be the other panelists who will have different perspectives, but what I've seen from trying to build a tool that we want to market, QB Scribe, is when we speak to these SMEs who actually do want to codify their knowledge and do want to adopt their new technology, is that there is such a variety of information and such a variety of formats, and it's hard to actually come up with a certain set way to display that in a way has utility for everybody. Right? That we find extremely difficult. In fact, it's not only finding a common one, it's something that one method that maybe works for one subset is actually seen as a negative by another subset. And so how to match it all together makes it very difficult. There is very much sometimes because of the industry or the particular work environment that it has to be one way or else it won't work. Oftentimes, like we've discussed many times before, it's more of a inertia or a cultural thing. So from building a product point of view that purports to help with this, that's the problems that we see.
I'd say that for me, the biggest challenge is that we often work with a parent standard, and the engineers use that standard for 10, 20, 30 years. So they're used to the terminology, the structure, the way it's written. We often see requirements in parent standards that are paragraphs. Mm-hmm. And then in that one paragraph, we'll have, you can have 2 requirements in one sentence. So by the time you've got to a paragraph, you could be 10 requirements in. And whilst they've tried to write it in a long way and explain it and be helpful, we often find that they're ambiguous. So it's changing the mindset that we just want a short, sharp sentence saying this shall be this, and bang, that's it. That's all we need. And then we move to the next one. So I think the challenge is that our engineers like to see the exports that we do. So we're gradually moving from a sort of a paper document-based system to a digital system. So again, as an engineer myself, I like to see a Word document or in the spreadsheet. However, we know that in the real world now going forward, we want to just see a single line of text with a number against it, and that's it. We don't. And so I think they're the two biggest challenges that I'm seeing on the projects.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Anything else to add from the others?
I'll say from my perspective, really, it's about the benefits to the SMEs, because sometimes they have a feeling, like Stefan alluded to, that they're losing their power if they start, transferring all that knowledge out into a codified form. I think it's about explaining that the benefits to them as well, in terms of what the process is trying to achieve and how their role in that sort of process. Because if they do not engage, then the whole process breaks down because you don't get that knowledge from them. So it's quite important to have them on side, and by having them on side, it's not in a way of telling them they've been replaced or been removed, or it's all about how they're always a bit like academic. You're just spreading the knowledge and cascading it down to the next generation, really. And it's that sort of perspective, I think, that's really crucial for them to really get on board with the knowledge sort of transfer. Because even myself, I always try to check with my teams that am I cascading that information down to you in terms of what I've the experience I've gained with, the clients, the intelligence, the understanding with the specifications, with the standards, how they're slightly changing or slightly interpreted by different technical authorities, am I transmitting the knowledge back to them? So I always check in with my team as well. So I think it's that sort of steady progressive behavior. I think that's really quite required. Otherwise, the whole process just breaks down.
And what would you say those benefits are? When you're trying to show the benefits of, hey, if this is documented properly, that other people can get that information when they need it, what is the benefit to the person that traditionally held all that information themselves?
I always tell them time. They've got time back to think about other things rather than be encumbered by the little details.
I guess that goes back to what you were saying, Stefan, of, if you get fewer requests for clarification on a project set of requirements that you put out, the organization obviously benefits financially from not expending resources on that, but also the people who own that specification, they get a personal benefit of being able to focus on the other things without, would you say interruptions are the best way to say it? Like when these questions come back, is it interrupting those people in the middle of their other processes? Benga kind of positioned it as, having more time to think about other things that they're working on and focus. But would you say that distraction element is one way of looking at it?
No, I don't think it's more distraction. It's because you expect the clarifications to come. But the way we look at it is, we look at the man hours we spend, both our own man hours and also those of a supplier or contractor, because eventually we also end up paying for those. So it's the man hour efficiency that you can bring back. So you can say, instead of spending, 2 weeks reviewing a set of clarifications, you could spend 2 weeks actually reviewing a design, or 2 weeks instead of spending 2 weeks generating clarifications, you could spend 2 weeks creating a design because you understand the requirements up front. And so for me, it's less about distraction, but more about freeing up time and making it more efficient in what you do with it. And I think going back to the question from the audience, the two challenges we have is getting the right information from the SMEs. So making sure you are actually getting information that's going to be valuable going forward, and then packaging that information in a usable fashion to the future, to the people that are going to be using it, so that you don't just give them, here's a large document, or here's a set of lessons learned, or here's a presentation, or here's a video, but actually tailoring it such that the right person sees what they need to see from it.
Yeah,
I think one thing to think about or remind ourselves is, at the end of the day, we're dealing with people, and people are all different. So that we've got people that will embrace this 100% and be fully supported, and you've got others that just need persuading to come on board. It's about people management as much as it is the technology side.
That's not necessarily something you develop in your engineering kind of education background. Right? That's where that real world experience comes back in.
You have to.
You have to in your career.
Absolutely. Excellent. So I'll just leave it open for any other kind of questions or comments on the discussion. If anybody else had anything else they wanted to ask another panelist, or anything else that came up along the way, I'll just leave it open if there's any other points that want to be made or questions to be asked.
Yeah, I was going to ask Mark, actually, in terms of what you've noted with the workings across the different sort of geographies, different age groups, has there been a consistent theme across, or has it all been quite unique to all the different groups you've been working with, in terms of either the challenges with codifying or understanding how requirements are recorded?
Speaking as a mechanical engineer, we feel, and we don't really have the data to support it, but we feel that the electrical sector are more welcoming to change than a mechanical one. And I can say that comfortably because I'm a mechanical person. So that's a possible one. And I don't think age is necessarily a fact. It is a factor, but I don't think it's the biggest one. But I'm also possibly seeing that possibly geographical is becoming more. It's about trust, I think. It's about the work group's trust of the suppliers, of the EPCs, and based on bad experiences, which is quite understandable if you're going in and you want to change a international standard. you've got to have a lot of trust. So there are some trends, but I wouldn't say that they stand up solidly. And I think my position changes throughout the year depending on work groups that I work with. So it's a bit of a vague answer, but it's not. Yeah, we don't. I've got a gut feel, but there's no real science to it.
Thanks, Mark. And actually, I had one question for Stefan. You talked about the landscape, and I thought about that because we have sort of baby boomers going through, and they've had a level of experience which has been quite interspersed with not that much technological change compared to the new generation that's experienced rapid change. Would you think that the knowledge that they have and that they can transfer would be relevant at a point, let's say 10, 20 years down the line, with all the complexities in delivery we're looking at in terms of, decarbonization, circular economy, and all the sort of issues that are coming up?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question. It's one that I ask myself a lot, actually, in terms of just my own longevity in a career as an engineer. Is what I've learned now, is that going to be relevant in 10, 20 years? And I think back to a couple of the core skills that you develop. So, I see a lot of people become very reliant on the technology, and they haven't sort of inherent trust in the information that's presented to them. And what I've seen from those that have had a bit longer experience where they haven't had that rapid rise in technology is that they kind of have a view that trust needs to be earned. So they don't automatically look at a graph or a trend for a machine, or they don't automatically look at something that's shown to them and say, oh, I trust that implicitly. They actually go a bit behind the scenes and go, well, let's have a bit more of an in-depth dive. Let's have a bit more of a look behind what really is the metrics. And by doing that, sometimes they highlight errors, or they highlight things that people have overlooked. And it's kind of taking a step back and pausing, So, one of the things that I learned early on in my career, which has nothing to do with technology, but is, when you're looking at something that's quite difficult or stressful, and you're about to make a judgment on it, you're about to take a decision. If that decision isn't a life-threatening or immediately impacting someone or some process, it's worth taking a step back, maybe sleeping on it, maybe having a look at it again when you've got a fresh set of eyes, and always you have a different perspective and you see things that you've missed. So I think it's bringing that element of not implicitly trusting everything that you see that the data tells you immediately in front of you.
Yeah, I think its degree of skepticism is extremely important, and we see that with some sectors where it is a bit of a strange relationship with technology, because on the one hand they trust whatever is presented to them, and then at the same time they somehow think technology can solve technology can't solve all the problems, and somehow they say, oh, but if they wanted to, they could have used technology to fix this problem. So at the same time, there's a deep distrust, but also a trust of what's presented to them as being very factual, instead of really understanding that even if you're presenting a graph that was produced by a tool, still a human took some raw data, had to interpret it to actually present that. So you can never actually remove the human element from that. But extremely important to always keep that in mind.
Excellent. Well, we are at the end of our time here today, so I want to thank all of our panelists for joining today. This was a really interesting discussion, and we certainly enjoyed, and we know our audience, both live and watching the recording, will enjoy it as well. For those that are watching live, do want to let you know about our next event coming up. You can always visit qracorp.com/webinars to see what's coming up next. The next one that we have on the list will be December 14th, empowering junior engineers to write better requirements. That will be at the same time, 11 a.m. Eastern North American time, and so later in the afternoon for our folks in the UK and in other parts of Europe. So invite you to join that one with us. We'll look forward to seeing you there. And for those of you watching this recording, check back with qracorp.com codifying.com/webinars to see our next upcoming events as well. So thank you again, everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.